The stagecoach rolled into Cedar Creek, Wyoming Territory, on a September afternoon in 1878, and Josephine Thatcher stepped down into a town that had already made up its mind about her before she ever set foot in the dust. She did not know that yet. She only knew her legs ached from 3 days of hard travel, that her trunk held everything she owned in this world, and that somewhere behind her, back along the rutted road that stretched east toward Missouri, a man named Silas Grimm was writing letters meant to ruin her before she could ever start over. The driver set her trunk down beside the depot and touched his hat brim, and Josephine stood for a moment taking in the town. Cedar Creek was not much to look at, a scattering of clapboard buildings along a single wide street, a livery stable, a church with a modest steeple, a general store with a porch where two old men sat whittling and watching her with open curiosity. The mountains rose blue and distant to the west, and the air smelled of sage and dust and wood smoke, so different from the damp river air of the town she had fled. She smoothed the front of her gray traveling dress, lifted her chin, and walked toward the general store, because a woman traveling alone with little money needed information, and information was usually found where people gathered to gossip. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and the woman behind the counter looked up sharply. She was perhaps 50 years old, with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face, and eyes that missed nothing. "Help you?" the woman asked, though her tone suggested she hoped the answer would be no. "I'm looking for work," Josephine said. "I saw a notice perhaps, or I wondered if you might know of any household in need of a housekeeper or a hand with children." "I am willing to do most anything honest." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Thatcher, did you say your name was? When you signed for your trunk with the driver," Josephine's stomach tightened. "Yes." "Josephine Thatcher. Funny thing," the woman said slowly, setting down the ledger she had been writing in. "A letter come through here not 2 weeks past, addressed to whoever might be keeping the peace in this town, warning that a woman by that very name might be passing through, and that she ought not be trusted with money nor with decent folks' children. Said she stole from her own late husband's business and fled west ahead of the law." The store seemed to grow very quiet. Josephine felt the blood drain from her face, felt the old fear rise up in her throat like bile, that same fear she had carried since the night Silas Grimm had stood in her parlor with his hat in his hands and told her, quite calmly, that she would marry him and sign the store over to his name, or he would see her hanged for a thief. "That is a lie," Josephine said, and her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake. "I took nothing that was not owed to me, and I have proof of who the true thief was if anyone in this territory cares to hear it." "I am sure you would say so," the woman said, unmoved. "I am Agatha Prescott, and I run this store, and I will tell you plainly, Mrs. Thatcher, that I do not much care for strangers who arrive with trouble trailing them like a shadow." Josephine wanted to argue further, wanted to lay the whole ugly truth of it out on the counter between them, but she had learned in the last 2 years that words meant little against a rumor already planted. She thanked Mrs. Prescott stiffly, though there was nothing to thank her for, and turned to leave. It was then that she saw the notice pinned to the board beside the door, half curled at the corner from the weather. "Wanted," it read in careful block letters. "Housekeeper and governess for a widowed rancher's household. Must be patient, kind, and willing to work hard. Inquire of Ralph Sheridan, Sheridan Ranch, 12 miles north of town." She tore it down before she could think better of it, and Mrs. Prescott's voice followed her out the door. "You will not last a week out there," the woman called. "Ralph Sheridan has gone through 3 housekeepers already, and none of them could manage that boy of his. It takes more than a pretty face, Mrs. Thatcher." Josephine did not answer. She stepped out onto the porch, into the wide gold light of the afternoon, and clutched the notice in her hand like it was the only solid thing left in the world. She had come west with almost nothing, a trunk of clothes, a small leather satchel with the last of her savings sewn into the lining, and a battered ledger book wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of her trunk that she would have burned rather than let Sela's Grim ever find again. She had come west believing that distance alone might be enough to start fresh. Standing there on that porch, with the whole town already suspicious of her, she began to wonder if any distance would ever be far enough. She was still standing there, uncertain of her next step, when a wagon rattled up the street and stopped in front of the store. The man who climbed down from the seat was tall, sun-browned, with dark hair curling out from beneath a battered hat and a face that looked as though it had not smiled in some time. He moved with the easy strength of a man who worked outdoors, but there was a weariness about his shoulders that spoke of burdens carried too long alone. He tipped his hat to her out of plain courtesy as he passed toward the store steps, and then he paused, seeming to notice the paper crushed in her hand. "Pardon me," he said. "That notice you are holding, might I ask where you found it?" "On the board just inside," Josephine said. "I confess I took it down. I hope that was not presumptuous of me." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of surprise, maybe even hope, quickly guarded. "I am Ralph Sheridan," he said. "That notice is mine to post. I have been needing help out at my place for some time now, longer than I care to admit." Josephine studied him for a moment, this stranger who did not yet know the rumor that had already poisoned half the town against her. She thought of simply walking away, of sparing him the trouble that seemed to follow her like a hungry dog. But she thought too of her dwindling coin purse, and of the long road behind her, and of how tired she was of running. "My name is Josephine Thatcher," she said, watching his face carefully for the recognition she expected to see there. "I am newly arrived in Cedar Creek, and I am in need of honest work. I have experience keeping a household, and I am fond of children, though I have none of my own. I will tell you plainly, Mr. Sheridan, before you decide anything, that there is a rumor already circulating about me in this town, one that paints me as a thief. I did not steal from anyone. I was accused falsely by a man with reason to want me silenced. But I would rather you know that before you consider hiring me than have you learn it from Mrs. Prescott and think I hid it from you." Ralph Sheridan was quiet for a long moment, studying her with eyes the color of strong coffee, eyes that seemed to be weighing something far heavier than her words alone. "Mrs. Prescott has never much cared for anyone she did not know from birth," he said finally. "I have lived here 9 years, and she still asks after my intentions like I might run off with the church collection plate." A ghost of a smile touched his mouth, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "I will not pretend the accusation does not give me pause, Mrs. Thatcher. I have a son at home, and his welfare is the only thing in this world I care about anymore. But I have also learned that this town loves nothing so much as it loves a rumor, true or not. I would rather judge for myself. That is more fairness than I have been shown in some time," Josephine said, and she meant it. "Well then," Ralph said, "I have business to finish in town, supplies to load, and a few words to have with the blacksmith about a wagon wheel. If you are willing to wait an hour, I would be glad to carry you out to the ranch myself, so you might meet my son and see the place, and we might discuss terms. I will not promise you the position, but I will promise you a fair hearing." "That is all I have ever asked of anyone," Josephine said, and for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she felt something loosen in her chest. The ride out to the Sheridan Ranch took the better part of an hour, the wagon rattling over a rutted track that wound through open rangeland dotted with sagebrush, and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees following a dry creek bed. The mountains grew larger ahead of them, their peaks already dusted with early snow though autumn had barely touched the lower country. Cattle grazed in scattered groups across the golden grass, and once a hawk wheeled overhead, its cry sharp and lonesome against the enormous sky. Ralph did not speak much during the ride, and Josephine found she did not mind the silence. It gave her time to gather her thoughts, to prepare herself for whatever waited at the end of the road. She studied the back of his hands on the reins, calloused and strong, and the set of his jaw, and wondered what manner of man he truly was beneath the guarded courtesy he had shown her. "You said you have a son," she ventured after a while. "How old is he?" 9, Ralph said. His name is Daniel. A pause, longer this time, and when he spoke again his voice had roughened. 2 years ago we had a fever come through the county, scarlet fever, took a great many folks, children especially. My wife Mary did not survive it. Daniel did, but the fever left him blind. Doc Reynolds says it happens sometimes, some complication of the illness settling in the eyes. There was nothing to be done. I am so very sorry, Josephine said, and she was deeply, though she had learned that words offered little comfort against grief so raw. Everyone is sorry, Ralph said, not unkindly, but with the flat weariness of a man who had heard the sentiment too many times to feel it any more. Sorry does not put breakfast on the table or teach a blind boy his letters, or keep him from wandering into the creek, because he forgot to count his steps from the porch. I have had 3 women try to help me since Mary died, good women, hard-working women, but none of them could manage Daniel. He does not warm easily to strangers. He has learned that people leave. And you are afraid I will leave too, Josephine said quietly. Ralph glanced at her sideways, something unreadable in his expression. I am afraid of a great many things where that boy is concerned, Mrs. Thatcher. I will tell you honestly, I do not know what to make of you yet. But my son has gone through more disappointment in 2 years than any child ought to bear, and I will not bring one more person into his life who does not intend to stay the course. I cannot promise you forever, Josephine said. I have learned better than to promise things I cannot see the shape of, but I can promise you that if I take on this work, I will not treat your son as a burden to be managed. I know something of losing everything at once, Mr. Sheridan. I know what it is to feel the ground disappear beneath you. If your son needs patience, I have plenty of it. I have had to teach myself patience these last 2 years, whether I wanted to learn it or not. Ralph said nothing more, but Josephine thought she saw his shoulders ease just slightly, as the wagon crested a low rise and the ranch came into view below them. A sturdy log house with a wide porch, a barn, a scattering of outbuildings, all of it settled into a wide green valley with the creek running silver along its edge. A boy sat on the porch steps as they drove up, a slight figure with sandy hair and features that so clearly echoed his father's that Josephine felt her heart clench at the sight. He held a walking cane across his knees, its tip worn smooth, and at the sound of the wagon he turned his face toward them, though his eyes did not track their approach the way a sighted child's would have. "Papa," the boy called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "It is me, Daniel," Ralph answered, drawing the wagon to a stop. "I have brought someone to meet you." Josephine climbed down from the wagon on her own, not waiting for Ralph's assistance, and walked toward the porch steps slowly, mindful of startling the boy. She had read once, in a newspaper article about a school for the blind back east, that sudden movements and unexpected touches could frighten a person who could not see them coming, and she kept that lesson close now. "Hello, Daniel," she said, stopping a respectful distance away. "My name is Josephine Thatcher. I have come from a long way east, and your father has been kind enough to bring me out here to meet you." The boy tilted his head, listening in that particular way she would come to know so well, as though he were reading the air itself for information sighted people gathered through their eyes. "You sound tired," Daniel said, with the blunt honesty of a child. But not the mean kind of tired, the kind like you have been carrying something heavy a long way. Josephine felt a lump rise in her throat, so struck was she by the accuracy of the observation. "That is a very perceptive thing to say." "I listen better than most people," Daniel said matter-of-factly. "Papa says it is because I cannot see, so my ears do the work my eyes used to do." Mrs. Kellerman never sounded tired. She sounded like she was always mad about something, even when she was not saying anything mad. He paused. "You do not sound mad." "I am not mad," Josephine said, and found herself smiling, a real smile, the first one that had come easily to her in longer than she cared to remember. "I am hopeful, actually. I am hoping your father might let me stay and help around your home, if that would be all right with you." Daniel considered this with the gravity of a much older person weighing an important decision. "Can you read?" he asked. Mrs. Wilkins before her, she could not read hardly at all, and she was supposed to help me with my letters, but she just wanted me out from underfoot. "I can read very well," Josephine said. "I used to read to my husband in the evenings before he passed. I have a fondness for stories, especially ones with adventure in them, ships and far-off places." "I like stories about horses," Daniel said, "and outlaws if they get caught in the end and the good ones win." "Then it seems we shall get along very well," Josephine said, and she saw over the boy's head that Ralph Sheridan was watching this exchange with an expression she could not quite name, something between disbelief and cautious wonder. That evening, after Josephine had toured the small but well-kept house, met the two ranch hands who worked the cattle, a weathered old cowboy named Pete Doyle and a younger man called Jim Halloran, and after she had helped prepare a simple supper of beans and cornbread and fried salt pork, Ralph found her alone on the porch as the sun sank behind the mountains in a wash of orange and violet. "He has not taken to anyone like that since his mother passed," Ralph said, leaning against the porch post, his hat in his hands. "Not Mrs. Kellerman, not Mrs. Wilkins, not even his own aunt when she came to visit last spring. I do not understand it." "Perhaps he simply trusts what he hears more than what other people tell him to think," Josephine said. "He has not heard the rumors about me yet. He has only heard my voice and judged it on its own merit." "Perhaps that is exactly it," Ralph said slowly, and something in his tone told her he was turning the idea over carefully, examining it from every angle the way a man examines a horse before he buys it. "The whole town is ready to believe the worst of you on the strength of one letter, and Agatha Prescott's suspicious nature. My son, who has more reason than anyone to be wary of strangers, decided within 5 minutes that you were worth trusting. I find that I am inclined to weigh his judgment rather heavily, Mrs. Thatcher." "Does that mean I have the position?" Josephine asked, hardly daring to hope. "It means you have a trial," Ralph said. "1 month, room and board and a fair wage besides. We can discuss the particulars. If at the end of that month Daniel is happier and this household runs smoother, we will speak of something more permanent. Does that suit you?" "It suits me very well, Mr. Sheridan," Josephine said, and she extended her hand to seal the arrangement in the manner of any business agreement, which he shook with a firm, calloused grip that sent an unexpected warmth up her arm. "Ralph," he said, "if you are to live under my roof and raise my son alongside me, you might as well call me Ralph." "Then you must call me Josephine," she answered, and for the first time in 2 years, standing on that porch with the Wyoming sky deepening into a canopy of stars overhead, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps she had finally found a place where she might be permitted to simply be herself, unburdened by the lies that had chased her so far from home. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Josephine found she loved more than she had expected to. She rose before dawn each morning to start the fire and prepare breakfast, biscuits and gravy or fried eggs from the small flock of hens she tended in the yard, and she found a quiet satisfaction in the simple work of running a household that had, she realized, been sorely neglected in the wake of Mary Sheridan's death. But it was the hours she spent with Daniel that filled her heart most completely. She began teaching him his letters properly, not with a slate and chalk as one might teach a sighted child, but by carving raised letters into thin boards with a knife borrowed from Pete Doyle, letting Daniel trace the shapes with his fingertips until he could recognize each one by touch alone. She read to him every evening after supper, adventure stories and tales of the frontier, doing different voices for different characters until Daniel laughed so hard he nearly fell off his chair. She learned, too, from him. Daniel taught her to identify birds by their calls, the sharp cry of the red-tailed hawk, the chatter of magpies, the mournful call of the mourning dove at dusk. He taught her to walk the path to the creek with her eyes closed, counting her steps, feeling the change in the ground beneath her feet from packed dirt to soft sand to the cool press of water. "You have to trust your feet," he told her solemnly, "because your eyes will lie to you sometimes, but your feet never do." "That is very wise for a boy of 9, Josephine told him, and Daniel had shrugged with the offhand modesty of a child who did not yet realize how remarkable he truly was. Ralph watched all of this from a careful distance at first, still guarded, still measuring. But Josephine noticed the way his expression softened whenever he came upon her and Daniel together. Whether it was during their reading sessions on the porch or during the afternoons, she began taking Daniel out to the barn to introduce him properly to the horses, letting him run his hands along their flanks and learn their names by the particular quality of their wickers. One evening, perhaps 3 weeks into her employment, Ralph lingered at the supper table after Daniel had gone to bed, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands. "I have not seen him laugh like this since before the fever," he said quietly. "I had begun to think I never would again." "He is a remarkable child," Josephine said. "You have raised him well, Ralph, even through such terrible grief." "I have raised him half blind myself, if I am honest," Ralph said, a note of self-reproach in his voice. "Not in body, but in patience. I did not know how to help him after Mary died. I did not know how to help myself, if I am being truthful. I threw myself into the work of the ranch because it was easier than sitting still with my own grief. And I fear Daniel felt that absence even more keenly than the loss of his sight." "Grief does not follow any sensible schedule," Josephine said. "I lost my husband to a fever much like the one that took your wife, though his did not spread to anyone else, thank the Lord. I know something of throwing oneself into work simply to avoid feeling the size of the hole left behind." Ralph looked at her then with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Tell me about him," he said. "Your husband, if you are willing." And so, for the first time since arriving in Cedar Creek, Josephine told the fuller truth of her story. Not the guarded version she had offered Ralph on the road, but the whole of it, the way the words seemed to want to spill out of her now that she had found someone willing to listen without judgment. "His name was Edward," she said. "We were married 4 years, and though it was not always a love match in the way the storybooks describe, we built a good life together in a small town in Missouri. He owned a mercantile store, and I helped keep the books, and we were content, if not passionately happy. He took ill in the winter of '76, a lung fever that would not break, and he died after 6 weeks of suffering, despite everything the doctor tried." "I am sorry," Ralph said softly. "His business partner was a man named Silas Grimm," Josephine continued, and she felt her hands tighten involuntarily in her lap at the mention of his name. "After Edward died, Silas came to me within a month, before Edward was even cold in his grave, and told me that as the surviving partner, he intended to take full control of the store, and that I would have no claim to it unless I agreed to marry him. I refused. I found the notion repugnant, marrying my late husband's business partner for the sake of a roof over my head. But in refusing him, I made an enemy, Ralph, a dangerous one. What did he do? I discovered, while going through Edward's private ledgers after his death, records that Silas had never known I had access to, that he had been embezzling from the store for nearly 2 years, small amounts here and there, enough to add up to a considerable sum. I believe now that Edward may have suspected it himself before he died, though he never said so to me directly. When I confronted Silas with what I had found, he did not deny it. Instead, he threatened me. He said that if I ever spoke of it, he would go to the sheriff and claim that I was the one who had been stealing, that I had falsified the ledgers myself to hide my own theft, and that with Edward gone, it would be my word against his, and his family had lived in that county 3 generations while I was still considered an outsider, having married in from another town. That is a coward's threat, Ralph said, his jaw tightening with an anger that Josephine found strangely comforting, as though her pain had become his own to be indignant about. I did not stay to test whether he would carry it out, Josephine said. I took the ledger, the true one with his own handwriting in the margins where he had tried and failed to cover his tracks, and I left in the night with what little money I had saved, and I have been running ever since, town to town, always wondering if his letters would arrive before I did, poisoning the well against me before I ever had the chance to prove myself an honest woman. And Mrs. Prescott's rumor, Ralph said slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. That was his doing. I have no doubt of it, Josephine said. He has friends among traveling salesmen and freight haulers, men who pass through many towns along the routes west. It would not be difficult for him to send letters ahead, painting me as a thief before I ever arrived to defend myself. Where is this ledger now? Ralph asked. Sewn into the lining of my trunk, Josephine said. I have carried it every mile of the way because it is the only proof I have that I am not the villain of this story. Ralph was quiet for a long moment, and then he reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, a gesture so simple and so unexpected that Josephine felt her breath catch entirely. I believe you, he said. I believed you before you ever told me any of this, if I am honest. I have watched you these 3 weeks, Josephine. I have watched how you are with my son, how you work from dawn until dark without complaint, how you never once asked for anything beyond what was owed you. A woman capable of the cruelty this Silas Grimm describes would not have the patience to carve letters into wood for a blind boy who cannot even see her kindness reflected back at him. Daniel saw the truth of you before any of us, and I have come to trust his judgment as much as my own, perhaps more. Josephine felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unbidden. No one has said such a thing to me in a very long time, she managed. Then it is past time someone did, Ralph said, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them charged with something new and fragile and entirely unspoken, until Josephine gently withdrew her hand and rose to clear the supper dishes, her heart pounding in a way she had not felt since she was a much younger woman, before grief and fear had taught her to guard herself so carefully. The trial month passed, and Ralph did not need to consult anyone, not the sheriff, not Doc Reynolds, not even his own hesitant heart, to know that Josephine Thatcher would not be leaving the Sheridan Ranch anytime soon. He offered her a permanent position with a wage that made her protest it was too generous, and she accepted, and life on the ranch settled into something that felt, for the first time in 2 years, almost like peace. But peace in Cedar Creek was never permitted to last uninterrupted, and trouble arrived first in the small, ordinary way that trouble often does, disguised as misfortune rather than malice. It happened on a chilly morning in late October, when Ralph discovered that the tin box he kept in his desk drawer, containing the cash set aside for winter supplies and the wages owed to Pete and Jim, was missing nearly $40. He searched the drawer twice, then the whole desk, his frustration mounting, and when Jim Halloran happened to mention over breakfast that he had seen Josephine near the study the previous afternoon, dusting the shelves as she did every week, an uncomfortable silence fell over the table. I did dust in there yesterday, Josephine said carefully, feeling the weight of unspoken suspicion pressing down on her. But I touched nothing in the desk, Ralph. I swear it to you. I am not accusing you, Ralph said, though the strain in his voice suggested he was fighting to keep an old, learned wariness from creeping back into his judgment. I am only trying to understand where the money has gone. It was Daniel, sitting quietly at the end of the table with his bowl of porridge, who spoke up into the tension. I know where it is, he said. Every head turned toward him, though of course he could not see the attention he had drawn. What do you mean, Daniel? Ralph asked. I took it 2 days ago, Daniel said, with the particular guilt of a child confessing something he knew had been wrong. I wanted to buy Josephine a present from the peddler who comes through, the one with the music box that plays a song, because she told me a story about her mother's music box back home and how she missed the sound of it. I did not think anyone would miss the money before the peddler came back through, and I was going to put back whatever was left over. Ralph closed his eyes for a moment, torn between relief and exasperation. Daniel, that was not your money to take, even for a kind reason. I know that now, Daniel said miserably. I am sorry, Papa. I only wanted to make her happy. Josephine crossed the room and knelt beside the boy's chair, taking his small hand in hers. You have already made me happier than any music box could, Daniel, she said gently. But your father is right. You must never take money that is not yours to take, even for a good reason. Will you show him where you have hidden it? Daniel nodded, still red-faced with shame, and led them to a tin can buried beneath a loose floorboard in his bedroom, where the money sat untouched, exactly as he had described. Later, once Daniel had been gently but firmly lectured and had gone off to apologize properly to Pete and Jim for the delay in their wages, Ralph found Josephine alone by the well, drawing water for the evening meal. I am sorry, he said, for the moment of doubt at the table. It was not fair to you, and I knew even as the thought crossed my mind that it did not sit right, that it did not match anything I have seen of your character these past weeks. You are only human, Ralph, Josephine said. And I understand better than most how quickly suspicion can take root, even against our better judgment. I do not fault you for a single moment of doubt, so long as you did not let it settle into certainty. It never did, Ralph said. Not truly. I think some part of me was simply waiting to see if I would fail you the way this town already has, and I am glad to find I did not. Josephine set down the water bucket and looked up at him, the autumn sun catching gold in her hair where it had come loose from its pins during the morning's work. You have not failed me once since the day you offered me a ride out from town, she said softly. I do not think you are capable of it, Ralph Sheridan. The moment stretched between them, warm and quiet, and Ralph found himself studying the curve of her face, the steadiness in her eyes, and thinking that he had not felt anything like this stirring in his chest since long before Mary had passed, since perhaps the earliest days of his own courtship, when the whole world had still felt full of possibility. He did not kiss her that day, though the thought crossed his mind with startling clarity. Instead, he simply reached out and tucked the loose strand of hair behind her ear, a small, tender gesture that left them both a little breathless. And then he cleared his throat and excused himself to check on the cattle, leaving Josephine standing by the well with her heart beating far too quickly for a woman who had told herself, only a month before, that she had given up on the notion of being loved again. The town's opinion of Josephine did not shift all at once, but shift it did slowly, in the way that opinions in small communities tend to change, one small kindness and one witnessed truth at a time. When Doc Reynolds fell ill with a bad case of influenza that November, it was Josephine who rode into town 3 days running to help his wife nurse him back to health, sitting up through the worst of his fever with cool cloths and patient hands, and the town took note. When the schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Charlotte Ames, mentioned in passing at the Sunday service that Daniel Sheridan had learned to write his full name using the raised letter boards Josephine had made him, and that he seemed happier and more settled than she had ever known him to be, several of the older women exchanged glances that suggested their certainty about the newcomer's wickedness had begun to waver. Even Mrs. Prescott, though she would never admit to being wrong about anything, grew notably quieter on the subject, especially after Josephine came into the store one afternoon, and rather than avoiding the woman as she might once have, greeted her with unflinching courtesy and purchased a length of blue calico without a hint of the resentment she surely had every right to feel. By the time the town gathered for its annual harvest social in early November, a celebration held in the largest barn on the edge of town with fiddle music and long tables of food brought by every family for miles around, Josephine found herself, for the first time since her arrival, greeted with something approaching genuine warmth by more than a few of her neighbors. Ralph asked her to dance that evening, the fiddler striking up a lively reel, and though Josephine protested that she had not danced in years and would surely embarrass them both, he simply took her hand and drew her out among the other couples, and within a few turns around the barn floor, laughing at her own missteps, she found she did not care whether she embarrassed anyone at all. "You are smiling," Ralph observed, his hand warm at her waist as they turned together beneath the lantern light. "I did not think I remembered how," Josephine admitted. "It has been a long while since I had much reason to." "Then I intend to give you many more reasons," Ralph said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the music, and Josephine felt her heart swell so full she thought it might burst from her chest entirely. Daniel sat nearby on a hay bale beside old Pete Doyle, tapping his foot in time to the music, and when the dance ended and Ralph and Josephine came to sit beside him, breathless and glowing, the boy tilted his head toward them with a knowing smile. "You sound happy, Papa," he said. "You sound different than you used to, lighter somehow." "I believe I am happy, Daniel," Ralph said, and he reached over to ruffle his son's hair. "I have you to thank for it in no small part. If you had not trusted her from the very first day, I might never have looked past my own fear long enough to see what was right in front of me." "I told you," Daniel said, with the smug satisfaction of a child proven right. "I told you she sounded like sunshine." It was 3 weeks after the harvest social, with the first true snow of the season dusting the mountains and a bitter wind beginning to sweep down across the open range, that trouble arrived at the Sheridan Ranch in a form far more dangerous than gossip or misplaced coin. Josephine was in the kitchen preparing supper, Ralph and the hands out mending fence along the northern boundary where a section had come down in a recent storm, and Daniel was seated at the table practicing his letters on one of his raised boards, when the sound of an unfamiliar horse reached the yard. Daniel's head lifted immediately, his fingers stilling on the wooden board. "That is not Papa's horse," he said, "and it is not Pete's or Jim's either. I know the sound of all our horses, the way they walk, the way they breathe. That one is a stranger." Josephine felt an immediate, instinctive unease settle in her stomach, though she could not have said why. She crossed to the window and looked out, and the sight that met her there sent ice through her veins far colder than any winter wind. Silas Grimm sat astride a lathered gray horse in the yard, dressed in a fine gray coat entirely too formal for ranch country. His sharp-featured face set in the same cold, calculating expression she remembered from that terrible night in her parlor 2 years before. "Daniel," Josephine said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage though her heart was hammering fit to burst, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. There is a man outside I once knew, a dangerous man, and I do not want you anywhere near him. I want you to go quietly to your room and stay there, and if you hear anything frightening, I want you to take the emergency signal your father taught you, the one for the dinner bell. Do you understand me?" Ralph had taught Daniel a specific pattern on the old iron dinner bell mounted outside the kitchen door, 3 short rings followed by 1 long one, to be used only if the boy was ever alone and something was seriously wrong, a signal that would carry clear across the range to wherever the hands were working and bring them running. "I understand," Daniel said, and though his voice trembled slightly, there was a steadiness beneath it that spoke of a courage far beyond his 9 years. "Josephine, is this the bad man, the one from your stories who made your husband's death into a lie?" "Yes," Josephine whispered. "Now go quickly and quietly." Daniel slipped from his chair and made his way to his room with the sure-footed confidence of a child who had memorized every inch of his home, and Josephine drew a steadying breath before stepping out onto the porch to face the man she had run 2,000 miles to escape. "Silas," she said, keeping her voice level with an effort that cost her dearly, "you have gone to a great deal of trouble to find me." "You made it a great deal of trouble, Josephine, running the way you did, like a common criminal," Silas said, dismounting slowly, his movements deliberate, almost lazy, the movements of a man who believed himself entirely in control of the situation. "You have caused me no small amount of difficulty these past 2 years. Do you know how many towns I have had to write ahead to? How many lies I have had to spread, simply to make sure you never settled anywhere long enough to become a problem for me? I have done nothing but tell the truth wherever I have gone, Josephine said. It is you who has spread lies, Silas, and you know it well. The truth, Silas said with a thin, humorless smile, is a flexible thing, Josephine, especially when only one party holds the proof of it. I want that ledger. I know you took it. Give it to me now and I will leave you in peace and this pretty little ranch of yours can continue on undisturbed. And if I refuse, Josephine asked, though she already suspected the answer, then I will ride into that town of yours and tell them exactly what I told the sheriff back in Missouri, Silas said. That you poisoned your husband slowly over the course of his illness, feeding him something to weaken his lungs so that you might inherit his business free and clear. And that when I discovered your scheme, you stole the store's true ledgers to hide the evidence and fled before you could be arrested. I have a signed statement from a doctor back home, paid handsomely for his cooperation, who will swear your husband's symptoms were consistent with slow poisoning rather than natural illness. Josephine's blood ran cold at the sheer audacity of the lie, but she forced herself to remain steady. That is a fabrication, and you know it. Edward died of a lung fever that half the county could attest to. There were a dozen witnesses to his illness, the doctor who actually treated him, neighbors who visited, the reverend who sat with us in his final days. Witnesses can be persuaded to remember things differently, with the right encouragement, Silas said. Or they can simply be far away in another county, unavailable to speak in your defense, while I stand right here, ready to ruin whatever new life you have managed to build. That rancher you have attached yourself to, does he know the truth, I wonder, or only the sanitized version you have surely told him? How do you suppose he will feel, learning his son's governess is suspected of murdering her own husband? He already knows everything, Josephine said, with more confidence than she entirely felt in that terrifying moment. There is nothing left for you to threaten me with, Silas. Ralph believes me. This town has begun to believe me. You have wasted your journey. Something flickered across Silas Grimm's face, a flash of genuine anger breaking through his composed mask. Then I will simply have to be more persuasive, he said, and he took a step toward the porch, his hand moving toward the inside of his coat in a gesture that made Josephine's heart seize with terror. It was at that exact moment that the dinner bell began to ring, 3 short bursts followed by one long, urgent peal that carried clear across the valley on the cold afternoon air. And Josephine realized with a rush of gratitude and fear combined that Daniel, rather than simply hiding as she had instructed, had crept to the kitchen door and pulled the bell rope with all his strength, sounding the alarm that would bring Ralph and the hands riding hard for home. Silas froze at the sound, clearly unsettled by this unexpected development, and in that moment of hesitation, Josephine did the only thing she could think to do. She reached into the folds of her apron, where she had, in a moment of desperate foresight weeks earlier, taken to carrying the small oilcloth-wrapped ledger whenever she felt uneasy, a habit born of 2 years of running that she had never quite been able to shake. "You want your proof of guilt, Silas," she said, holding the ledger up where he could see it. "Here it is, in your own hand, every falsified entry, every dollar you skimmed from a dying man's business while pretending friendship to his widow. I have kept it safe this whole time, and I will keep it safe still, because it is the one thing standing between you and the truth ever coming to light." Silas lunged for the porch steps, his composure entirely abandoned now, and Josephine backed away, clutching the ledger to her chest, her mind racing for some way to hold him off until help could arrive. But before he could close the distance between them, the thunder of hoofbeats sounded from the northern trail, and Ralph Sheridan came riding into the yard at a dead gallop, Jim Halloran and Pete Doyle close behind him, all 3 men having heard the emergency signal and abandoned their fence work without a second thought. Ralph swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped, closing the distance to the porch in a few long strides, placing himself bodily between Silas Grimm and Josephine, with an expression of such cold fury that even Silas, for all his bluster, took an involuntary step backward. "I do not know who you are," Ralph said, his voice dangerously quiet. "But you will explain yourself, and quickly, or you will find yourself explaining it instead to the barrel of my rifle." "This is a private matter between myself and Mrs. Thatcher," Silas said, though his confidence had visibly wavered. "It does not concern you, sir." "She is under my roof and my protection," Ralph said. "That makes it very much my concern. Now, who are you?" "His name is Silas Grimm," Josephine said, stepping up beside Ralph, her voice steadier now that she was no longer standing alone. "He is the man I told you of, the true thief, the one who has spent 2 years spreading lies about me across half this territory to keep the truth from ever catching up to him." Pete Doyle had by now dismounted as well, and he moved to stand at Silas's other side, his weathered hand resting meaningfully on the pistol at his hip, while Jim Halloran positioned himself to cut off any thought of retreat toward the waiting gray horse. "You are outnumbered, Mr. Grimm," Ralph said. "And you are trespassing on my property, and from what I have just heard, you have also just threatened a woman in my employ. I suggest you think very carefully about what you say next." Silas's eyes darted between the 3 men surrounding him, calculating the odds, and Josephine watched the bluster drain out of him like water from a cracked jug. "I have committed no crime here," he said, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. "I have only come to retrieve property that was stolen from me." "The ledger belongs to Edward Thatcher's estate," Josephine said, "and by extension to me as his lawful widow. You have no claim to it whatsoever, and every entry in it proves your own guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. I intend to see it delivered to the proper authorities, Silas, whether that be here or back in Missouri. Your reign of threats and lies ends today." "You would not dare," Silas said, but the words came out weak, unconvincing even to his own ears. "I would," Josephine said, "and I will. I am done running from you, Silas Grimm. I have found people here who believe in my honesty, without needing to be convinced by anything more than their own good judgment." She glanced at Daniel, who had crept out onto the porch behind them, his cane in hand, his sightless eyes turned toward the commotion with an expression of fierce protectiveness that seemed far too old for his young face. "Even a boy who has never once seen my face knew the truth of my character within minutes of hearing my voice. That is worth more to me than anything you could ever threaten me with." Ralph turned to Jim Halloran. "Ride into town and fetch the sheriff. Tell him we have a matter of fraud and extortion that requires his attention, and that the man responsible is currently detained at my ranch." Silas made a sudden, desperate move as though to bolt for his horse, but Pete Doyle, despite his years, moved with surprising speed and caught the man's arm in an iron grip. "I would not try that, son," Pete said, in the mild, unhurried tone of a man who had wrangled far more dangerous creatures than a cornered swindler in his long years on the range. "Running from the law only makes a judge less inclined toward mercy, and from what I have just heard, you are going to need every ounce of mercy you can find." By the time Sheriff Owen Butler arrived from town an hour later, the cold afternoon light fading toward evening, Silas Grimm had been persuaded, through the combined pressure of Ralph's barely restrained anger and the very real presence of the sheriff's badge, to make a full confession, admitting to the embezzlement, to the false accusations against Josephine, and to the fabricated doctor's statement he had commissioned back in Missouri to support his lie about Edward Thatcher's death. "You will be held here until arrangements can be made to send you back to Missouri to face proper charges," Sheriff Butler told him, securing his wrists with a length of rope in the absence of proper irons. "Where I expect the authorities there will have a great deal of interest in your ledger books and your paid doctor both." "This is an outrage," Silas protested weakly. "The only outrage here," Sheriff Butler said, "is that a good woman was made to run halfway across the country and live under a cloud of suspicion for 2 years because you could not keep your hand out of a dying man's cash box. Count yourself fortunate that Mr. Sheridan here did not simply shoot you the moment you set foot on his land, which, given the circumstances, no judge in this territory would have faulted him for. As Silas Grimm was led away toward town, his fine gray coat now dusty and his composure entirely shattered, Josephine felt the weight of 2 years of fear finally begin to lift from her shoulders, so suddenly and so completely that her knees nearly buckled beneath her. Ralph caught her before she could stumble, his arms coming around her with a strength and tenderness that steadied her more than anything else could have. "It is over," he said softly, against her hair. "It is truly over, Josephine. You do not have to run any more." "I hardly know how to believe it," she whispered, her voice breaking at last, all the fear and exhaustion of the past 2 years finding release in the tears she could no longer hold back. "I have been afraid for so long, Ralph. I had almost forgotten what it felt like not to be." "You are safe now," Ralph murmured, holding her close in the gathering dusk while Daniel, sensing the shift in the air around him, made his way carefully across the porch to press himself against her other side, wrapping his small arms around her waist. "I knew you were telling the truth," Daniel said, his voice muffled against her apron. "I knew it from the very first day. You cannot fool ears like mine, Josephine. You never sounded like a liar, not even once." Word of Silas Grimm's confession spread through Cedar Creek within a day, carried on the same efficient network of gossip that had once painted Josephine as a criminal, and this time the town's judgment swung entirely, decisively, in her favor. Mrs. Agatha Prescott, to her credit, made a point of seeking Josephine out at church the following Sunday, and though the apology she offered was gruff and somewhat begrudging in its delivery, it was sincere enough in its substance. "I judged you unfairly," Mrs. Prescott said, her sharp eyes not quite meeting Josephine's. "I have run this town's gossip mill for near 20 years, and I pride myself on knowing character when I see it, but I let a stranger's letter cloud my judgment before I ever gave you a fair chance to prove yourself. That was not right of me, and I am sorry for it." "Thank you for saying so," Josephine said, and she meant it, for she had learned enough in her difficult years to know that an apology, however imperfect, was worth accepting with grace. With Silas Grimm gone, escorted back to Missouri in the custody of a federal marshal to face the charges that awaited him there, and with the ledger safely delivered to the proper authorities to ensure his guilt would be thoroughly documented and punished, Josephine found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely free of the fear that had shadowed every step of her journey west. It was on a clear, cold evening in early December, with the first heavy snow of the winter blanketing the ranch in soft white silence, that Ralph asked her to walk with him out to the small rise behind the house, where a single cottonwood tree stood sentinel over a modest wooden marker, the grave of Mary Sheridan, tended carefully through every season. Josephine hesitated at the edge of the small fenced plot, uncertain of her welcome in a place so clearly sacred to Ralph's grief, but he took her hand and drew her gently forward. "I wanted you to know her," Ralph said quietly, standing before the marker with his hat in his hands despite the cold. "Not in the way you might think, not to compare you to her, for that would not be fair to either of you, but because she was a good woman and she loved Daniel more than her own life, and I believe, had she lived, she would have wanted him to be happy again, the way he has become since you arrived in our lives. I think she would have liked you very much, Josephine. I think she would have thanked you, as I am thanking you now, for giving our son back the laughter he lost along with his sight." Josephine felt tears sting her eyes, though these were not the tears of fear or grief that had marked so much of her recent life, but something gentler, something that felt almost like gratitude. "Thank you for sharing her with me," she said softly. "I would never wish to replace her, Ralph. I only hope I might be permitted to build something new alongside the love you carry for her, rather than in place of it." "That is exactly what I am hoping for as well," Ralph said, and he turned to face her fully then, his breath visible in the cold evening air, his eyes reflecting the last light of the setting sun. "Josephine, I have known you only a few short months, but in that time you have brought more light into this house than I believed possible after everything we lost. My son loves you as though you had always been part of his life. I find that I love you too, more deeply and more completely than I expected to ever feel again after Mary passed. I'm not a man given to grand speeches, and I have little to offer beyond this ranch, this land, and a heart that has been slow to heal but is entirely yours now that it has found its way back to feeling anything at all. Would you consider becoming my wife, Josephine Thatcher? Would you consider staying here not as our housekeeper, but as Daniel's mother and as my partner for whatever years remain to us? Josephine did not need to consider her answer for even a moment. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Ralph, I will marry you. I came west believing I had lost everything worth having, and instead I found a home I never dared to hope for, and a boy who taught me that sometimes the people who see us most clearly are the ones who never need their eyes to do it. I love you, Ralph Sheridan. I love Daniel as though he were my own. There is nothing in this world I want more than to stay here with you both, for as long as I am given. Ralph drew her into his arms then, beneath the bare branches of the cottonwood tree, and kissed her softly, tenderly, a kiss that carried within it all the hope and healing of the months since her arrival, while the snow fell silently around them and the first stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. When they returned to the house, hand in hand, to share the news with Daniel, the boy let out a whoop of pure delight that echoed through the rafters. I knew it, he crowed, dancing in a small circle of excitement despite his cane clattering to the floor beside him. I knew you two would fall in love. Pete owes me a whole nickel. He bet me it would not happen before spring. Daniel, Ralph said, laughing despite himself, you should not be making wagers with the ranch hands about your father's romantic affairs. You should have been faster about it then, Daniel said, entirely unrepentant, and Josephine laughed until tears streamed down her face, holding both of them close, this small, imperfect, wonderful family that had somehow, against every fear she had carried across 2,000 miles of hard road, become her own. They were married in the small Cedar Creek church on a bright, crisp morning in January of 1879, with snow still lying heavy on the ground outside, but the interior of the church warmed by a roaring stove and by the presence of nearly the whole town, come to witness the union of the widowed rancher and the woman whose innocence had been so thoroughly and publicly vindicated. Josephine wore a simple gown of pale blue, sewn by Miss Charlotte Ames with careful, loving stitches, and Daniel stood proudly at his father's side as the boy who had insisted, from the very first day, that Josephine Thatcher was exactly the woman their family needed. Mrs. Prescott, in a gesture that surprised nearly everyone present, provided the wedding cake free of charge, declaring gruffly that it was the least she could do to make amends for her earlier misjudgment, and the whole town gathered afterward in the same barn that had hosted the harvest social, dancing late into the evening while Daniel sat perched on Pete Doyle's shoulders, laughing and clapping along with the fiddle music. More joyful than anyone in Cedar Creek had seen him since long before the fever took his sight. The years that followed brought their own quiet joys to the Sheridan Ranch. Josephine settled fully into her role as wife and mother, and Daniel flourished under the combined love and patience of both his parents, growing skilled enough with his cane and his memory of the ranch's every path and fence line that he could move about the property with a confidence that astonished visitors who did not know him well. When he turned 12, Ralph and Josephine arranged for him to spend a term at a school for the blind in Denver, where he learned to read using the raised dot system that was slowly spreading westward from the eastern schools, and he returned home the following summer prouder than Josephine had ever seen him, able to read entire books with his fingertips, a skill he demonstrated to anyone who would sit still long enough to watch. In the autumn of 1880, Josephine gave birth to a son, whom they named Edward in honor of her first husband, a small act of remembrance that Ralph had insisted upon himself, understanding better than most the value of honoring the past even while building something new. 2 years later came a daughter, whom they named Mary after Ralph's first wife, a decision that brought tears to Ralph's eyes when Josephine first suggested it, and which Daniel declared, with all the authority of an older brother, to be the finest name any baby sister could possibly have been given. The ranch prospered in those years, as cattle prices remained strong and the Sheridan herd grew steadily under Ralph's careful management, aided now by Daniel, who at 15 could identify individual cattle by the particular sound of their bawling, and could ride a horse across familiar range with a confidence that left visiting cattle buyers shaking their heads in amazement. On quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done and the younger children had been put to bed, Ralph and Josephine often sat together on the porch where they had first properly come to know one another, watching the sun set behind the mountains in its endless procession of gold and violet, and Daniel would sometimes join them, settling into the chair that had become his own, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling into night, the lowing of distant cattle, the wind moving through the cottonwoods, the comfortable silence of a family that had weathered its share of storms and come through the other side whole. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never meeting at all?" Josephine asked one such evening, some years into their marriage, resting her head against Ralph's shoulder. "If Silas had simply let me be, if I had never needed to run, I might never have found my way to Cedar Creek at all." "I have thought of it often," Ralph admitted, "and I have decided that some things are simply meant to find their way to us, however difficult the road that leads there. You needed a place to be believed, and we needed someone who could see past what everyone else assumed to be true. It seems to me the Almighty has a way of putting the right people in each other's path, even when the path itself is a hard one to walk." "I could not agree more, Papa," came Daniel's voice from his chair nearby, and though he could not see the smile that spread across both his parents' faces at his words, he heard it clearly enough in the warmth of their answering laughter, and in the contented silence that followed, filled only with the sounds of a Wyoming evening settling gently over a family that had, against every hardship that had once threatened to tear it apart, found in each other exactly the truth they had all been searching for. And so the Sheridan Ranch continued on through the passing years, its fields green in summer and white with snow in winter, its house filled with the laughter of children and the steady, abiding love of two people who had learned, each in their own difficult way, that the truest sight often belongs not to the eyes at all, but to the heart willing to listen closely enough to hear it.